It is Friday, March 29th, 2019. It is 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time, and so you know what time it is. It's time for a little bit of coin metal. And it was a kind of chill get your ass kicked at Jiu-Jitsu Friday. I most certainly did get my ass kicked. I was doing the last round of sparring, man. The guy that I was rolling with, he kind of cheated. He kind of cheated because he did a little bit of a dirty trick. It's called minor digital manipulation. He thought he had a hold of my foot. I don't think he was actually intentionally quote unquote cheating. But he thought he had a hold of my foot, and he actually just had a hold of my toes. So it's like, yeah, I'll go wherever you want me to go. If you got a hold of my big toe, yeah, go right ahead, man. Lead on. Anyway, so we did some armbar stuff today, which I like the armbar, but we also did some triangle choke, and the triangle choke is one of those that's kind of tough for me because of my body shape, and also I've always had a little bit of trouble orienting with my lower body. I don't know really how to put it, because on my footing I'm okay, but like sometimes, figuring things like, put your knee to the ground and then try and pull it out from under you or something to that effect would be kind of difficult for me to work through mentally. And so anyway, I was rolling with this guy, and he was a blue belt too, so he had the experience advantage there, and also I think he's also got a lot of wrestling in his repertoire. Nonetheless, he didn't go 100% on me. We were doing a 50% round, but I did pull him to my guard a little bit hard, and I did hold him in a little bit hard. I let up just a little bit, and of course I probably shouldn't have, because he kept going at the same pace. Anyway, it was a little bit tougher, but instead of trying to muscle my way through it, for the most part, I really did, try and take advantage of the fact that he was in a more dominant position, and try and utilize that opportunity to ferret out some of the things that I could do to rectify the situation. And I had some proto thoughts that would have worked, if I'd have waited just a little bit longer in my setup or set it up a little better. But for the most part, he stayed on top. I'll say it right there. He didn't submit me. He came close a couple times, but I did manage to stave that off. Nonetheless, and again, I did not use solely strength to get out of things. I was doing things like, I grabbed my the inner thigh of my gi, and like he was gonna go for I think it was a Kimura, and so I grabbed the inner thigh of my gi, and that's something that even if you're not really really super strong, that can prevent somebody from pushing your arm to your side and again locking down that Kimura. But in any case, it was a very very spirited evening. We did this one thing, and I honestly love it. It was a setup for a triangle where, if you didn't get the triangle, you could still work it around to an arm bar. And it was, or no, it's a triangle on the other side or something to that effect. It seemed like it was just like a triangle, like a switch from triangle on one arm to a triangle on the other arm. And I thought that was pretty pimp too. But in any case, yeah, triangles, they're not exactly the easiest thing for me to do. But nonetheless, I did try and get that perpendicular thing, where you reach really deep and you hook around their if they've got you. Let's see, I'm trying to think of how to explain it. So if you're trying to triangle somebody, and you've got their you've got your right leg up their back, and the left leg kind of pinching on the side there to hook your arm through around their left leg, around their left thigh basically, and pull yourself to it. And I found that the orientation, if you can get just slightly past 90 degrees, that motion, if you look at a pair of scissors, there's like two types of triangles, okay? There's a pliers type of triangles and a scissors type of triangles. And the Danaher version of the triangle, and you can look that one up on YouTube. Like I think it's like Danaher triangle short leg or something like that. In any case, that one is more of a scissor. Where if you look at a pair of scissors, you have one blade on top of the other. Well, that's the orientation of your legs in that triangle, where you've got your right leg is over the back of his neck, or that side of it, and that your left leg is pinching up on his underarm, and that was the kind of the advantage, I guess. And so anyway, when you don't really have any of the shoulder in the way there when you're squeezing that one. And whereas when you're just putting your left foot up on their hip and then swinging yourself to like a 90-degree angle and getting the triangle in that way, that one you actually have to do to where you squeeze down on him. Whereas with the scissor one, it's a little bit different in that you get the shoulder enough out of the way that you really don't have to swing the arm over. Whereas with the pliers type of triangle, you have to swing the arm over your body and get it on the other side there to be able to grab your leg and rotate and sink it in, right? Well, with the scissors type of triangle, you do not necessarily have to do that. And as a matter of fact, it's probably better if you don't, because with that pinch, you bring the top of their arm against the one side of the neck, and then your leg is on the other side of the neck. And so it takes just barely a little pinch, and it's tap, 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 tap. Because there's just so much pressure, and again, you got to get it deep in there. But that's one that I found that, like, if people do that triangle on me in particular, because I got pretty broad shoulders and my neck is kind of thick, so it's a little bit tougher to triangle me, and plus I do a lot to avoid being triangled. I mean, even though people get the setup on me all the time, I manage to avoid it doing just a couple little tricks. But in any case, with the triangle, if you didn't pull that arm all the way through, trying to rotate just a little bit further off, more past a little bit past 90 degrees there, by hooking that thigh with your right arm and pulling yourself around, I really like that version of the triangle, because it doesn't feel like I need to do as much pressure with either of my legs in order to really have a secure triangle and put my opponent out. So, anyway, enough of that business. As far as where we're going to go with our first dance, I've been playing the shit out of body count for the first dance. And I meant to go through Between the Buried and Me, and I've got 2 albums by them. I don't play any of the music because I can't tell what the fucking song title is. For whatever reason, the metadata, when I copied the albums over, the metadata didn't include the fucking song titles. Anyway, so that is definitely out. What the hell? We haven't played this song in a little while. We're going to go for it. Body count, first dance. Talk shit. Get shot. Here on Coin Metal. And that was Dope with I Survive. And it is with that. I got in a conversation today with with Soon Rock, Mr. Verge Dev, the guy behind Verge Currency. And so, we've been friends for a long time, so every once in a while we have disagreements, and that's cool, I mean, if you can't have disagreements with your friends, who the fuck can you have disagreements that you take, like with any kind of seriousness with? You know what I mean? So anyway, I'd said something about, the Green New Deal wasn't viable or whatever, and so he did something that it's one of my tricks, and I love it. I don't think that he did it because I do it. I'm just saying it's a trick that I like doing. He asked me, he's like, well, what makes you say that? And I thought about it a moment. I'm like, what does make me say the Green New Deal is a bunch of hokey bullshit? Maybe it's because there's a silly idealist that's the one that's trying to sell it, right? And so I thought about it. I'm like, you know what? I've never even really looked at anything about the Green New Deal. And so maybe I need to, check myself, Check out, see if maybe my bias is derived from a bunch of window dressing that's been put all over the MSM, has absolutely nothing to do with the Green New Deal or AOC or anything like that. And so, that's just how I am. I like to check myself every once in a while, check my bias. Find out exactly, am I just drinking my own Kool-Aid, or is there something to it, And so that's a risky run all the time, man. That you sell yourself on an idea and you don't bother to test it against the veracity of reality. And we can believe all kinds of silly things that way. But in any case, so I decided that, I was going to hunt down the Green New Deal and find out exactly what the fuck it's all about. Because it seems like it's about a lot of shit. I mean, and when I say shit, I don't mean crap or, not worthy of discussion. I mean that it's got a lot of stuff in it. It's not just covering one little range of data. It encompasses a lot of stuff. And so anyway, I just want to give you an idea of all of the stuff it covers, because it's pretty significant. But we want to get into one area in particular, and it's because it probably relates to us, because a lot of the underpinnings, this Green New Deal thing, this thing is not new. And the fact that AOC is the big flag bearer for it, I think is just kind of silly, because a lot of the measures talked about in here, I don't know, maybe she would have some real appreciation for it. Maybe sometime have her on the show or something. I don't know. Anyway, but I think there's a lot of stuff in here that's maybe a little over the pay grade. It might have been that this was in a stack of stuff that's been circulating around Washington, and she needed something young and idealistic to go with, and this is pretty idealistic. I'll just be honest with you. And only in one case, though. It's not that it can't be done. It's not that it wouldn't be good to do it. Okay, it's kind of idealistic in expecting people to do it. I mean, there's some interests out there that it seems like their only concern is how much money they're making doing what they're doing. It's not. It's like everything else is in the periphery, and it doesn't really matter. Despite the fact that we're all kind of interconnected at one point or another. But that's like their soul shit. This is why I exist, is to make money. The rest of y'all can go fuck yourself. So anyway, enough of that. So I decided I wanted to dig into the Green New Deal, because the fact of the matter is the media has been kind of hijacked, and it has been that way for quite a while. And it seems that the way that information is portrayed, or packaged rather, is meant to drive the mentality of the average person towards the subject matter in a specific direction. And what that direction may be, I couldn't tell you, but maybe, just maybe, if we dive into this, we'll understand exactly what they've been trying to obscure by wallpapering AOC's maniacal grinning face all over it. And again, it's not her best shot, but I think it's really funny. There's a lot of things I find really funny about her. I mean, sometimes I think she was just an actress, really. And I don't know. It could be. It could be just my cynicism speaking there, and it is deep. But let's get into this thing. A Green New Deal. Joined up policies to solve the triple crunch of the credit crisis, climate change, and high oil prices. And this is the first report of the Green New Deal Group. This report is the first publication of the Green New Deal Group, meeting since early 2007. Its membership is drawn to reflect a wide range of expertise relating to the current financial, energy, and environmental crises. These views and recommendations of the report are those of the group writing in their individual capacities. The report is published on behalf of the Green New Deal Group by NEF, the New Economics Foundation. Let's see here. The Green New Deal Group is in alphabetical order. Larry Elliott, economics editor of The Guardian. Colin Hines, co-director of finance for the Future, former head of Greenpeace International's economics unit. Tony Juniper, former director of Friends of the Earth. Jeremy Leggett, founder and chairman of Solar Century and Solar Aid. Carolyn Lucas, Green Party MEP. Richard Murphy, co-director of finance for the Future and director Tax Research LLP. Ann Pettifor, former head of the Jubilee 2000 Debt Relief Campaign director of Operation Noah. And Charles Secret, advisor on sustainable development, former director of Friends of the Earth. And Andrew Sims, policy director, NEF, the New Economics Foundation. Okay. We'll go through their preface here. The global economy is facing a triple crunch. It is a combination of a credit-fueled financial crisis, accelerating climate change, and soaring energy prices, underpinned by an encroaching peak in oil production. These three overlapping events threaten to develop into a perfect storm, the likes of which has not been seen since the Great Depression. To help prevent this from happening, we are proposing a Green New Deal. Let's go through the executive summary here. Forward, which I guess we haven't actually read the forward. Unless this is page 5? Is this page 5? Let's see what page we're on. It doesn't actually tell me. That's weird. And let's see, the triple crunch, financial crunch, climate crunch, the coming global energy crunch. Part 2, the Green New Deal, renewal of the financial system, facing the climate and energy crunches, lessons from history, facing the climate and energy crunches, policies and financing. Endnotes. Alright, and so the executive summary. The global economy is facing a triple crunch. It's a combination of a credit-fueled financial crisis, accelerating climate change and soaring energy prices underpinned by an encroaching peak in oil production. These three overlapping events threaten to develop into a perfect storm, and we already read that part. This entails re-regulating finance and taxation, plus a huge transformational program aimed at substantially reducing the use of fossil fuels, and in the process, tackling the unemployment and decline in demand caused by the credit crunch. It involves policies and novel funding mechanisms that will reduce emissions, contributing to climate change and allow us to cope better with the coming energy shortages caused by peak oil. The triple crunch of financial meltdown, climate change, and peak oil has its origins firmly rooted in the current model of globalization. Financial deregulation has facilitated the creation of almost limitless credit. With this credit boom have come irresponsible and often fraudulent patterns of lending, creating inflated bubbles in assets such as property and power, environmentally unsustainable consumption. This approach hit the buffers of insolvency and unrepayable debts on what we think of as Detonation Day, August 9th, 2007, when the banks finally understood the scale of debt on the balance sheets of other banks and stopped lending to each other. I got some umbrage with that one. There was a little event going on in the background that not a lot of people pay attention to with regard to the last financial crisis, but it was Wachovia. See, Wachovia was using drug dealer money, specifically Mexican drug cartel money, to collateralize a lot of the housing loans they were underwriting. And so I guess it was the IRS or somebody or another got wind of this, and they started investigating them because apparently they weren't taking as much credit as other banks were to be issuing loans against, right? It's like, where are these guys getting their money that they're not getting it from us, right? And so I don't know if the timing lines up with August 9th, 2007, but anyway, continuing on. In the same year, natural disasters struck body blows to entire national economies, and rising prices began to alert the world to the potential scarcity of oil. At both ends of the climate spectrum, Australia saw a prolonged drought decimate its domestic grain production, and Mexico saw floods wipe out the agricultural production of an entire large state. In the oil markets, growing numbers of whistleblowers point to the probability of an early peak in production and possible subsequent collapse in production. The International Energy Agency, IEA, said an oil crunch is likely in 2012. Drawing our inspiration from Franklin D. Roosevelt's courageous program launched in the wake of the Great Crash of 1929, we believe that a positive course of action can pull the world back from an economic and environmental meltdown. The Green New Deal that we are proposing consists of two main strands. First, it outlines a structural transformation of the regulation of national and international financial systems and major changes to taxation systems. And second, it calls for a sustained program to invest in and deploy energy conservation and renewable energies, coupled with effective demand management. And this is in this way, we believe that we can begin to establish or stabilize the current triple crunch crisis. We can also lay the foundations for the emergence of a set of resilient, low-carbon economies, rich in jobs, and based on independent sources of energy supply. This will create a more stable economic environment in which there is a lot more local production and distribution, and enhanced national security. In the first half of this report, we examine the financial, economic, and environmental landscapes that are the backdrop of this triple crisis. In the second half, we propose a series of policies that can be used to tackle the problems that we have identified. And I'm not going to read the entire part of Section 1 here, but I am going to go through the entire preface. But we are going to get into section 2 because it hinges more on the financial end, and that's really where I wanted to focus on this episode. So here we go. The Green New Deal. We call our program a Green New Deal, one that combines stabilization in the short term with long-term restructuring of the financial, taxation, and energy systems. The Green New Deal is international in outlook and requires action at local, national, regional, and global levels. Focusing first on the specific needs of the UK, an interlocking program of action needs to involve 1. Executing a bold new vision for a low-carbon energy system that will include making every building a power station, involving tens of millions of properties. Their energy efficiency will be maximized, as will the use of renewables to generate electricity. This will require a £50 billion plus per year crash program to be implemented as widely and rapidly as possible. We're calling for a program of investment and a call to action as urgent and far-reaching as the U.S. New Deal of the 1930s and the mobilization for war in 1939. 2. Creating and training a carbon army of workers to provide the human resources for a vast environmental reconstruction program. We want to see hundreds of thousands of these new high and low skilled jobs created in the UK. It will be part of a wider shift from an economy narrowly focused on financial services and shopping to one that is an engine of environmental transformation. The UK has so far largely missed out on the boom in green-collar jobs, with Germany already employing 250,000 in renewable energy alone. 3. Ensuring more realistic fossil fuel prices that include the cost of the environment and are high enough to tackle the climate change effectively by creating the economic incentive to drive efficiency and bring alternative fuels to the market. This will provide funding for the Green New Deal and safety nets to those vulnerable to higher prices via rapidly rising carbon taxes and revenue from carbon trading. We advocate establishing an oil legacy fund paid for by a windfall tax on the profits of oil and gas companies. The monies raised would help deal with the effects of climate change and smooth the transition to a low-carbon economy. 4. Developing a wide-ranging package of other financial innovations and incentives to assemble the tens of billions of pounds that need to be spent. The focus should be on smart investments that not only finance the development of new efficient energy infrastructure, but also help reduce demand for energy, particularly among low-income groups, for example by improving home insulation. The science and technology needed to power an energy and transport evolution are already in place, but at present the funds to propel the latest advances into full-scale development are not. 5. Re-regulating the domestic financial system to ensure that the creation of money at low rates of interest is consistent with democratic aims, financial stability, social justice, and environmental sustainability. My apologies. The initial proposals for financial renewal are inspired by those implemented in the 1930s. They involve the reduction of the Bank of England's interest rate to help those borrowing to build a new energy and transportation infrastructure, with changes in debt management policy to enable reductions in interest rates across all government borrowing instruments. In parallel, to prevent inflation, we want to see tighter controls on lending and the generation of credit. Let's see, where are we at there? 2, 4, 5, breaking up the discredited financial institutions that have needed so much public money to prop them up in the latest credit crunch. We are calling for the forced merger of large banking and finance groups. Retail banking should be split from both corporate finance, merchant banking, and from securities dealing. The demerged units should then be split into smaller banks. Mega banks make mega mistakes that affect us all. Instead of institutions that are, quote, too big to fail, we need institutions that are small enough to fail without creating problems for depositors and the wider public. Next, re-regulating and restricting the international financial sector or finance sector to transform national economies and the global economy. Finance will have to be returned to its role as servant, not master of the global economy, to dealing prudently with people's savings and providing regular capital for productive and sustainable investment. Regulation of finance and the restoration of policy autonomy to democratic government implies the reintroduction of capital controls. These are vital if central banks and governments are to fix and determine one of the most important levers of the economy, interest rates. Next, subjecting all derivative products and other exotic instruments to official inspection. Only those approved should be permitted to be traded. Anyone trying to circumvent the rules by going offshore or onto the internet should face the simple and effective sanction of negative enforcement. Their contracts would be made unenforceable in law. Ultimately, our aim is in an orderly downsizing of the financial sector in relation to the rest of the economy. Don't worry, we'll do it for you. Minimizing corporate tax evasion by clamping down on tax havens and corporate financial reporting. This isn't going to do you any good. Tax should be deducted at source, i.e. from the country from which payment is made, for all income paid to financial institutions and tax havens. International accounting rules should be changed to eliminate transfer mispricing by requiring corporations to report on a country-by-country basis. These measures will provide much-needed sources of public finance at a time when economic contraction is reducing conventional tax receipts. These people are fucking silly. We also urge the UK to take action at the international level to help build the orderly, well-regulated, and supportive policy and financial environment that is required to restore economic stability and nurture environmental sustainability. Our government's objectives should include 1. Allowing all nations far greater autonomy over domestic monetary policy, interest rates and money supply, and fiscal policy, government spending and taxation. 2. Setting formal international targets for atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations that keeps future temperature rises as far below 2 centigrade as possible, or Celsius rather. Delivering a fair and equitable international climate agreement to succeed the Kyoto Protocol in 2012. 4. Giving poor countries the opportunity to escape poverty without fueling global warming by helping to finance massive investment in climate change adaptation and renewable energy. 5. Supporting the free and unconstrained transfer of new energy technologies to developing countries. In the words of France's President Sarkozy, we have to put the stop to this financial system which is out of its mind and which has lost sight of its purpose. The Green New Deal will rekindle this vital sense of purpose, restoring public trust and refocus the use of capital on public priorities and sustainability. In this way, it can help deliver a wide range of social benefits that can greatly improve the quality of life in the future. there is also an immediate imperative to restore some faith that society can survive the dreadful threats it now faces as a result of the triple crunch. Beyond that, we believe the Green New Deal can deliver a crucial national plan for a low-energy future and its provision on the ground. The absence of any such plan at present leaves the country very vulnerable. There is no risk analysis of the peak oil threat. There is no contingency plan for what would happen if oil and or gas supplies collapsed rapidly. Our plan would include oversight and coordination for generating the funding from government, the energy industry, and a range of private savings vehicles for investment in a vital multi-decade program for the transition to a low-energy future. In short, it is a route map for the journey from energy and economic insecurity to one of energy and environmental security. This is kind of where I see the failure, because it's something where you're trying to exercise against the wills of pretty much everybody, and trying to organize them under a rubric that is of your creation, as opposed to one that may organically develop as a result of these same pressures that you're wanting to tax all kinds of people to pay for some sort of resolution of. Sorry, I had to rehydrate there. I can see a little bit of the source of the resistance is that some people would read this and without understanding what the payoff is for them or for society in general for making these kinds of moves. And I think the problem is that these are problems. These are issues. And the fact of the matter is that we've been dealing with them since then. This was authored originally in 2007. And, Bitcoin came along in 2009. Now, but mind you, this was before the credit crisis really became a really big issue. And, I talk about the displeasure of monetary value and the global finance collapse. It started with a $380 billion withdrawal. And then when the IRS checked Wachovya's books and they found this big-ass dividend in there, they're like, dude, where's the money? Like, we don't have it. Oh, well, you've been lying all this time? Well, no, we had it, but these guys came and made a withdrawal, and now we don't have it anymore. The fact that passed muster, that nobody, threw up major red flags for that alone and, imprisoned everybody from Wachovia, is beyond me. But anyway, that displeasure of $380 billion, okay, that's just the principle, okay? That's just the amount that they were collateralizing that got sucked out of the system. What it doesn't account for is all of the other billions of dollars that were loaned out against those $380 billion. I mean, we're talking about a lot of liquidity that was collateralized here to be financing home loans. So, I mean, how many trillion do you think it was? Maybe 7? That we paid back? They got to enjoy boats and hoes for about a decade or so. But no, we had to pay for all that shit. That's so ridiculous. Anyway, the point being is these guys were looking at it before the wave really hit and wiped out so much of the economy. But it took a little while for that little thing at Wachovia to catch up to everybody. It took, I want to say it was a couple months, But when I saw the first story about it, I was just like, oh no. I mean, I'd spent that time up until that point watching with some amount of distress the number of new homes that were being built in my area, and how the after hours TV viewing was all concerned about flipping houses and how you can make $1 million doing it. You know, like I said, I want to say like 2004, 2005. That's about when that shit started. 3 a.m. in the morning, and it's all, you can flip houses too, and I made such and such millions of dollars last year, and you can too. Well, yeah, we saw how that ended up, right? But anyway, they were looking at that financial crunch from the perspective of before that happened. And we're looking at it now, and we can see that from our perspective, at least those of us that are currently involved in cryptocurrencies, that it flies in the face of the proposed changes here. But at the same time, it falls in line with them. Because the desire here was to reduce the energy footprint and also improve the economy. When you consider the reduction of the number of personnel, the infrastructure involved, transitioning from a bank-based economy to a crypto-based economy, even if 20, maybe 30% of the economy transitioned over to cryptocurrencies, it would be a vast reduction in the amount of energy that's dedicated to our current banking system. Now, of course, it would take a little bit more energy than it currently does, because more people would need to be involved in mining cryptocurrencies in order for it to be worthwhile. I mean, more worthwhile than it is right now. And it's pretty worthwhile, I gotta say. But nonetheless, all of the friction points that these guys want to hang somebody on, that they can tax every transaction you're doing to get funds to focus towards this thing, it's no better than any other tax. I said to somebody today that the Portland city managers, they specifically take the funds that go to fixing potholes and shit, and they misappropriate it. They spend it on other shit that they think is a higher priority than getting products and people from point A to point B in Portland. And I say they do that because you look at the number of potholes and how they've made that city basically impossible to park in. Unless you're living somewhere there, and even then you got to pay for fucking parking somewhere. And I think that's just like utter bullshit, because they're trying to tax you into not having a vehicle. Well, you know what? If you do anything outside of Portland, you're either taking public transport or you have your own vehicle. So if you're running a business, you have to have your own vehicle. Well, that means you have to drive that vehicle on shitty roads. Anyway, the point being is, the funds could be accrued, whether or not they would actually be dedicated, and whether or not the funds were dedicated to things that were actually effectual in improving the situation. That's entirely up to question. We're having to trust another entity to do this shit. And I think it's sad, because we really don't need to. And the trust and the requirement for verifying whether or not everything happened the way that it was supposed to, and everybody signed an agreement to, and all that. The infrastructure just to maintain and enforce that shit takes up a lot of energy. It doesn't need to exist either. With cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, back in the day when they were just processing the transactions as received, instead of this replaced by fee bullshit and this whole off-chain bullshit, when they just functioned like that, where it was You put in your transaction, it goes into the mempool, it goes into the next block as received. Right? Back in those days, the need for trust was a lot lower even now, than even now with regard to exchanges and whatnot. Because either the transaction went through or it didn't. And of course that's still true of cryptocurrencies. However, I've noted that several things seem to be lagging down the process, because even Bitcoin Cash transactions are taking excessively too long. I mean, I had to wait a long time for my last transaction to get into the mempool by comparison to last time, or the time before last rather. And even then, I waited 2 forevers for my first confirmation, and that is a rarity, when, at least according to my experience, with regard to using Bitcoin Cash. But if it does become a regular issue, I can assure you that Bitcoin Cash will go the same route as Bitcoin when it comes to expensive use. If it's that much cheaper for somebody to use Dogecoin, and it's just as secure to do it with Dogecoin in Dogecoin, people will use Dogecoin. We are coming into a phase of cryptocurrencies, and I think some people mistake it for what it really is. You got these maximalists going around saying, oh, Bitcoin's the only one, and so on and so forth. No. That is just a bunch of dogma. What you need to be using is your own experience, and you can try these currencies out relatively easily. I mean, you just got to go to like an IRC channel forum and talk to the people that are involved in them now, and say, hey man, what's so great about this coin? And if they're enthusiastic about it and they're willing to stand behind their coin, they'll show you. They'll send you some fucking coin. They'll be like, hey man, download a wallet, send me the address. And they may or may not send you some money, but some of them will. And it doesn't require another party involved in that. But in order to be cheap enough to compete with those kind of currencies out there, and there are plenty of them out there, Bitcoin has to do certain things, such as either scale off-chain or on-chain. Off-chain is into Trustville again. And I know that a lot of people that are currently involved in it and currently have nodes live don't believe that. But in the longer term, in order to have channels that can handle enough volume to make it worth doing, I guess it's like the peak transaction is like $8 or something like that is like the average transaction. Yeah, I mean, try and pay your rent in $8 increments. But the point being, and there's no guarantee that the liquidity will be there and enough of the nodes on the channel to cover it. But the point I'm getting to here is that you've got those kind of barriers to entry into Lightning, and all of them make it a more expensive and painful process than simply scan, enter, send. When you can do an Ethereum transaction, scan, enter, send. When you can do a Bitcoin Cash transaction, scan, enter, send. Or a Verge transaction, or a Doge transaction, or a Monero transaction, or a Litecoin transaction. When you can do all of those as a scan, enter, send process that doesn't involve third parties, it makes all of the means that you have to use other cryptocurrencies kind of relative to that experience. It's like, well, I could use Bitcoin, but it's going to cost me about 15 times as much, and it's going to take me about 2 days in order to get my first confirmation, so that's probably not a good idea. I could use Bitcoin Cash, and it's going to cost me about, 5-10 times as much, but it's only going to take me about 2-3 hours to get my first confirmation. Or I could use Verge currency and pay, a tenth of what I would pay for a Bitcoin Cash transaction, same amount of money, mind you, and wait 30 seconds for the transaction to complete and get my first confirmation. When you're evaluating currencies on that scale, the ones that take way too much energy to mine and be secure, the ones that are too expensive by comparison to other options, those are the ones that are going to suffer the loss of adoption. The market, again, it'll only go so far with dogma, and in terms of survival, when you're looking at your money and the way you spend it in terms of survival, you're going to be looking at it in terms of what it's costing you to transact. And if it costs you 15 times more to do it one way than to do it the other, and it's just as secure, happens way faster, what are you going to choose? You're going to assess it according to your own value system, and you are going to pick a currency that suits your needs. And see, a lot of people are trying to build up the dogma so that you're making those associations with the currency instead of whether or not it's going to cost you 300 times as much to transact it in Bitcoin than it will in Doge. And it's sad because self-interest is at the root of all cryptocurrencies. You mine out of your own self-interest. You use one currency over another out of your own self-interest. Anyway, let's get back in this thing. Part 2, the Green New Deal, renewal of the financial system. Quote, I sincerely believe that banking establishments are more dangerous than standing armies, and that the principles of spending money to be paid by posterity under the name of funding is but swindling futurity on a large scale. This is by Thomas Jefferson, U.S. President, 1801 to 1809, and the author of the Declaration of Independence. Quote, I am still waiting for a clear, audible mea culpa. The only good thing about this crisis is that it is made clear to any thinking responsible person in the sector that international financial markets have developed into a monster that must be put back in its place. We need more severe and efficient regulation, higher capital requirements to underpin financial trades, more transparency, and a global institution to independently oversee the stability of the international financial system. I have already suggested that the IMF assume this role. And that was by Horst Kohler, German president and former head of the International Monetary Fund. Of course you think that. You're running the fucking fund. Conflict of interest. Continuing. Virtually none of the economics practiced today is relevant or helpful to the transformation of the economy at national, regional, or global level. You're wrong. The Green New Deal involves a dual approach. First, proposals for the renewal of the domestic and international financial system, including a changed regime of taxation. Second, proposals for state intervention to allow higher public and private expenditure targeted at environmental projects that will dramatically cut fossil fuel use and help to tackle climate change and peak oil. The transformation and re-regulation of the domestic financial system. Central to the transformation of national economies and the global economy will be the re-regulation and restriction of the international financial sector. Finance will have to return to its role as servant, not master of the global economy, to return to its given role of dealing prudently with people's savings and providing regular capital for productive and sustainable investment. Our initial proposals for financial renewal include, number 1, the reduction of the Bank of England's interest rate to a low level. Number 2, much tighter controls on lending and on generation of credit. Number 3, the forced merger of large banking and financial groups. We want to see the retail banking split from both corporate finance, merchant banking, and from securities dealing. This would echo the Glass-Steagall legislation of interwar America, which separated retail and investment banking, but was repealed in the 1990s. That was a mistake, by the way. 4. Breaking these demerged financial entities up into smaller banks on the principle that mega banks make mega mistakes that affect us all. Instead of institutions that are too big to fail, we should aim for institutions that are small enough to fail without creating problems for depositors and the wider public. 5. Subjecting all derivative products and other exotic instruments to official inspection. Only those approved would be permitted to be traded. Anyone trying to circumvent the rules by going offshore or on the internet would face the negative enforcement. Their contracts would be unenforceable in law. And one thing there, if somebody's trying to circumvent the law with the means that they're using to transact in, chances are they already gave up on the protection of the state, and they really don't give a fuck whether or not it's enforceable by law. Continuing on. 5. Subjecting all derivative we already went that one. 6. Offering the same protection for our remaining top-class industrial companies as is routine in France or the United States, and perhaps go further. Ultimately, our aim is an orderly downsizing of the financial sector. We've already been doing that. That's been something that the market itself has been producing. Continuing. Interest rates. This report recommends the adoption of low interest rates hardwired to credit and capital controls in order to limit any potential inflationary effect that would follow if they were offered in an unregulated market. I disagree with that one right there. I think that the most prudent expenditure is done by those responsible for handling the funds. If you are the person responsible for handling the funds, you will spend them most prudently. You know what it took to put the funds in your pocket to begin with. Some banker doesn't. Your representative in Parliament doesn't. Continuing. This is a critical component of the Green New Deal. Low interest rates mean that investment becomes significantly more affordable. We need massive new investment in renewable energy supply as part of the reaction that is required to the triple crunch we have identified as causing our current crisis. Put simply, an investment of £1,000 paid for over 20 years on fixed annual installments at an interest rate of 2% costs £61.16 a year, or about $1,223.20 to repay in total. At 5%, these costs increase to $80.25 in lira, or I keep wanting to say lira, but it's because of the weird sign for pounds, and £1,605 respectively. And at 8% to £101.86 and £2,037.20 respectively. The impact of low interest rates is therefore very clearly seen. They are vital if viable green alternatives are to be made available. Put simply, they make it possible to secure investment into new sources of energy, the jobs that create those resources and the future of our planet. Without them, all of these things may be in doubt. They have other possible benefits as well. Low interest rates allow the implementation of low-risk projects with a high probability of providing secure returns. They therefore ideally serve the interests of the most important group of savers, those who are saving for their retirement. There's only one problem with this, is that as soon as you get your foot in the door with this mandatory taxation that you're going to pin on people and yank $101.86 out of them a month, that will invariably increase. that the legislators will be looking at the funds being dedicated to it, and they'll be like, well, maybe if we bump it up to, 2.25%. Oh, yeah, that's really good, yeah. It's only bumping it up to, $67.32 a month, but these people can handle it, right? And then it'll go up again, and again, and again, and again. And before you know it, it's the biggest item on your tax list, and it hasn't gone down any, and it's not costing you any less. Anyway, continuing on. Our medium-term proposals for financial renewal involve control over capital flows, regulation of finance. Really consider this: control over capital flows. That means you're not free to invest as you see fit. What if you wanted to invest in an ethanol production plant that your friend was thinking of making, where you and a bunch of your friends are farmers? You want to gather up all of your tailings and give it to this other friend and let him make vegetable oil that you guys can make biodiesel out of. No, you can't invest in your shit that way, because that's... Anyway, continuing on. I didn't mean to derail this right here, but continuing. The idea of capital controls, regulation of finance, and the restoration of policy autonomy to democratic government implies the reintroduction of capital controls. These are vital as central banks and governments are to fix and determine one of the most important levers of the economy: the whole spectrum of interest rates, short and long, risky and safe. The idea of introducing capital controls will either be greeted by a feigned yawn from neoliberal economists. It's all been tried before and failed. The world has moved on. Electronic flows of money make controls impossible. Or else the sector will orchestrate public outrage, much as it did when Malaysia successfully introduced capital controls during the 1997 crisis. But the neoliberals ignore entirely the global prosperity engendered by capital controls during the period referred to as the Golden Age. The fact is that in a crisis, capital controls will inevitably be imposed. Only because it's a fucking crisis and you have to stop people from extorting one another $5 for a bottle of fucking water. Capital controls in this context, where we're speaking from now in 2019, are more or less impossible to enforce 100%, and they only hurt the least sophisticated and poorest among us. Continuing on. In June 2005, the Bank for International Settlements, perhaps one of the most conservative institutions in the financial system, addressed the problem of global imbalances and suggested that the international financial system could revert to a system more like that of Bretton Woods. It added that history teaches that this would only work smoothly if there were more controls on capital flows than is currently the case, which would entail its own costs. Such controls would not be hard to police. Large financial movements are tracked already by national authorities in the name of anti-money laundering measures. They use the technology that makes possible almost instantaneous money transfers and split-second dealings in cash and securities around the world. Moreover, there is a low-tech reinforcement for this high-tech equipment. Contracts or deals entered into in offshore jurisdictions or anywhere else in defiance of financial controls could be declared void in British law. This negative enforcement is highly attractive. It requires no police. It relies simply on British courts not doing something, i.e. recognizing and enforcing financial arrangements made without authorization. You know what? That kind of control is only as worth it as it is for people, as long as participating in it is cheaper than avoiding participating in it. And I think in the kind of context that you're drawing up here, you'd find that you're going to end up with a lot less compliance, that people will find other ways to circumvent you. Without introducing the need to circumvent you, you will experience a lot less friction. Continuing on. Both these methods of enforcement also give the lie to the objection that financial controls can only work with international agreements. Whatever. By imposing taxes and restrictions on capital and controlling flows in and out of their borders, governments will regain the power to exercise an independent monetary policy to fix interest rates appropriate to the home economy. Capital controls will preserve domestic savings and for domestic use. They will also help central banks to determine the full range of interest rates, short and long, real, safe, and risky, and to end exchange rate volatility, which hurts the productive exporting sector. Bullshit. Central banks have a range of capital controls in their armory. These will be vital to any transformation of the global economy, as they are the instruments that enable central banks to fix rates of interest. Returning this power to government and central banks will in turn allow them to begin the process of re-regulating the creation of money and credit by setting limits. Of their units. Again, if it is more attractive and you experience less friction using another means of transacting, what the fuck are you going to do? You're not going to be compliant, that's for damn sure, especially if it's putting food in your mouth or keeping a roof over your head. Continuing on, reform of taxation. Much of the current debate in taxation focuses on two things. First, how to secure taxes from itinerant people and capital. The second, which has captured many recent headlines in the UK, is how to tax foreign earnings remitted to this country. We believe these are not the most important issues. What is of most concern is the right of the nation state to tax the economic activity that arises within it at rates that it considers appropriate. What is key is the right to autonomy and self-determination in matters of taxation within a framework of international cooperation. We should be debating how the return on capital invested in the UK can be appropriately identified and taxed, and what action can be taken to ensure that money earned in the UK is not taken abroad without tax being charged. These are complex issues, and the discussion can only touch on the surface of this issue. But we have 6 initial recommendations and one further point of overriding urgency to recommend. These are, number 1, we must do away with the overly generous UK tax relief on the interest paid on money borrowed in the UK but used to finance a foreign business. This is simply using the UK tax system to subsidize foreign operations, and that is absurd. I'd agree with that one. Number 2, we need to commit to working with the EU on the common consolidated corporate tax base. This should include moving towards agreed methods of apportioning profits that eliminate most profit being artificially relocated to tax havens from consideration when allocating profits to countries. It has been shown that the UK would be 8% better off if it used such a system of apportionment. And they probably lose 8% of their population who's unwilling to go along with it. Probably the most well off of their population. Number 3, we need to know where companies are and what they are doing in each location in which they operate. The UK must back a call for country-by-country accounting, which can provide enormous benefits by showing what global companies are doing and where in order to facilitate appropriate taxation. At the moment, this kind of accountability of corporations to their host countries is absent. The tendency of capital to roam unfettered around the world has to be challenged. No, it's actually going to get worse. You can guarantee it. Number 4, we need a general anti-avoidance provision in UK law to provide the flexibility to neutralize the more esoteric forms of tax planning as they happen and not retrospectively. Yeah, good luck with that. Number 5, we need to strengthen transfer pricing provisions on payments to offshore havens if it cannot be demonstrated that the intellectual property located there was generated in the place to which payment is made. This is key. Intellectual property is not created offshore, it is relocated there. If intellectual property cannot be shown to have arisen in the place in which payment is to be made, then the UK should not allow tax relief. Number 6, we should abolish the domicile rule that so obviously makes the UK a tax haven. No, you shouldn't. You should just fucking ignore it. Why? Because the money being invested there, some of it will actually be spent there. And that increases the economic activity in your area, i.e., it exposes it to many more taxable events that you could be getting a hold of some of it. Continuing. One final essential change is that corporation tax should be reformed so that small companies have a quite different, separate tax. Small firms that are not owned by public limited companies, PLCs, or entities registered outside the UK and that do not qualify as large companies under company law probably account for 97% of all UK companies. They need their tax burdens to be reduced in order to bolster economic activity. At present, smaller firms are being hampered by rules created for the bigger companies that are responsible for most of the UK's corporate tax problems. That's a valid observation. Tax hideouts and open accounting. Enforcing openness and disclosure in tax havens is a long-term challenge. They have deliberately created opportunities for abuse within the world financial architecture. They will resist reform. Accounting is, though, a clear target for reform. Don't worry, we're working on it. Blockchain, globally verifiable, in real time. The International Accounting Standards Board is fast becoming a world standard setter. It did 2 things. It could expose secrecy spaces for the common good. First, it should require that off-balance sheet structures be brought back onto the books. It should also require country-by-country reporting by all multinational companies. This country-by-country reporting must disclose where a corporation is, what it is called in that place, what trade it undertakes there, what tax it pays in the location, and what assets it locates there. Most importantly, the trading data disclosed should be for both third-party and intra-group transactions. The information should be provided for every jurisdiction in which the corporation operates, without exception, for any reason. Yeah, dude, that good luck with that. If enacted, these reforms would, by default, become law in more than 100 countries in the world because International Accounting Standards Board proclamations have that effect. These reforms would shatter the secrecy of tax havens for the world, transform the way liabilities are recorded in company accounts, and bring an end to much of the abuse and securitization that has gone on to date. Actually, most of that shit is created due to regulation. Continuing. They would also expose the workings of hedge funds and private equity operators, disclose the identity of those companies that are abusing tax rules, and expose the nature of intra-group trade and some of the governance risks inherent within it. The information collected would end much of the transfer pricing abuse that currently denies the developing world tax revenues greater than the cost of the Millennium Development Goals each year. It has been rare to think of accountancy as a force for social good, but it could be. This is its opportunity. No, not really. global debt cancellation. Because of the buildup of vast levels of personal, corporate, and government debts since the 1970s, the need for redemption of these debts will be immense. After hubris must come catharsis. It is our view that societies might have to introduce a global jubilee of debt cancellation, an extraordinary amnesty for debtors. The first purpose of such an amnesty would be to release millions of people, business enterprises, and governments from the grip of parasitical creditors, draining them of every last asset. The second purpose would be to restore debtors to viability, enabling them once again to become productive and economically active. Yeah, we're already doing that. Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies is like the only thing that I have ever seen that successfully has made people from poor people into much richer people. It's the only thing. Anyway, continuing on. The third purpose would be to restore order and stability to the balance sheets of the financial sector, whose livelihoods would not be immune to the efforts of a severe and prolonged debt crisis. Without such a global jubilee, high-income Anglo-American economies could be mired in prolonged economic degradation caused by debt deflation for decades ahead, just as low-income countries have been mired in debt since 1982, and Japan in a deflationary environment since 1990. A prolonged crisis in rich countries will impact more severely on people in low-income countries. A global jubilee will release rich and poor countries alike from debt bondage. Whatever. Basically, you're telling creditors to stuff it. The Green New Deal and public expenditure. Our Green New Deal relies for funding on a mixture of public and private spending financed by borrowing. Such borrowing is essential during a depression when the government must intervene as the corporate sector shrinks. This government intervention generates employment, income, and saving, and associated tax revenues repay the exchequer. This is the multiplier process attributed to Richard Kine's closest follower. Yeah, you're wrong. Usually the employment is more like law enforcement and military personnel, and they're usually used to either seize the property of your next door neighbor or the country next door. One of the two. That's that whole global government intervention generates employment part. Yeah, that's it. It's because a lot of the people that aren't currently employed in the private sector would be employed as police officers and or military agents to go to somewhere else and steal other people's shit. Continuing. Any public spending should be targeted so that domestic companies benefit, and then the wages generated create further spending on consumer goods and services. Yeah, if it's in your hands, that's what happens. So combined, heat and power initiatives generate income for construction and technological companies, and then workers' salaries are spent on food, clothes, home entertainment, and theater, and so on, creating demand for those industries. How about workers' salaries are spent on trying to liberate themselves from having to fucking work for somebody else? By, I don't know, maybe making a company of their own that generates income of its own. Heaven fucking forbid, no. Industry is going to handle it all. Continuing on. The mathematics of this process are such that public investment should create an exactly increased amount of new savings rather than being a draw on existing savings. Equally, the higher level of saving as a result of public works will create demand for new savings instruments. This can be met with innovative government instruments such as green savings bonds. The same argument demonstrates that there is nothing wrong with the reliance on public expenditure for a good part of national economic activity. The extent of that activity should be a matter for political and democratic choice, for it merely directs real resources into certain uses while private impetus may direct resources elsewhere. The issue is solely complementary of purpose and full utilization of resource. Yeah, you're dreaming. What you can request is that companies be smarter in the way that they actually utilize resources. That's what you can request, and that's about the best you can do. Because if their manufacturing process includes something that you don't like, and you apply some sort of taxation or some sort of capital control on them, trying to get them to comply, they will simply move elsewhere. They will move out of your jurisdiction, out of your taxation realm. And they don't even have to physically do that anymore. Continuing on. Facing the climate and energy crunches, lessons from history. I have been charged with attempting to apply totalitarian methods to a free community. No criticism could be more misdirected. In a totalitarian state, the problem of the distribution of sacrifice does not exist. It is only in a free community that the task of government is complicated by the claims of social justice. The aim of these pages is, therefore, to devise a means of adapting the distributive system of a free community to the limitations of war. J.M. Kynes, How to Pay for the War, 1940. Yeah, bite my ass, dude. Continuing, in this chapter we consider the lessons from past decades of having to face constraints, the experience of mobilizing for war in the UK during the 1930s, and the special period in Cuba. Then in the final chapter we consider a set of actions for the Green New Deal in this modern context of triple crunch, and options for the financing of those actions. How constraints drive innovation, problem solving, and creativity. The World War II experience. Oh yeah, and just to let you know, the market can't respond to a stimuli that it's not experiencing. And if you're attempting to ameliorate the effects of a stimuli through policy, you're negating the effects of the free market in making a resolution for the issue on its own. So yeah, there's your innovation, problem solving, and creativity. Some unintended consequences of war and how society reacts to it can be positive. In Britain in the 1940s, war led to the empowerment of women, rapid technological advancement, and a healthier nation. Infant mortality fell, and life expectancy for those at home increased against a background of rapid cuts in consumption. The use of private vehicles almost ceased entirely, and the use of domestic electrical appliances fell significantly, as did overall household consumption. On the downside, there was also profiteering, defeatism, bigotry, paranoia, and bureaucratic incompetence. For example, more government efforts seem to go into planning the protection of national art treasuries than the defense of the civilian population. Our opportunity today is to learn the good lessons and try to avoid repeating the mistakes. Just to give you an idea here, the problem with this whole thing is you're trying to create an overarching entity that's going to be determining all these policies, right? Well, the funding for that has to be compulsory, because it has to be continuous. There can't be any hiccups in that facility receiving its funds, right? You know what that creates? That creates your bureaucratic incompetence. Because it doesn't matter how shitty I do my job, you motherfuckers are going to pay me anyway. And it doesn't matter if I hire my kid, and it doesn't matter if he's an absolute dunce. Can't put two and two together. Doesn't matter. Why? because he doesn't have to worry about getting fired. He's in the labor union. And it's virtually impossible to fire him. I mean, this is what goes on in the colleges, and it's one of the things that's going to bring down higher learning in America. At least I believe that it's a guaranteed vein. So you're going to draw every leech, every flea, every tick, every mosquito to that open vein. And that again is where you get your bureaucratic incompetence. So rather than creating the big bureaucracy that you're going to need to regulate all this bullshit, how about just not? Because then the problem will be left to us to deal with. And if it's left to us to deal with, we'll see how it actually expresses in our lives. If we are able to see that and experience that and understand exactly how it's impacting us, then we know how to fix it. Or the likelihood of us being able to fix it is that much better than if we're waiting for somebody 1,000 miles away who has no direct experience of our daily life to make that decision for us. And that's exactly what this Green New Deal proposes to do, is to make these decisions for us, which will guarantee that the reactions to the stimuli will never be correct for any of us. Except, of course, the bureaucratic administrators who get to vote themselves some pay raises. Continuing on. The approach to curbing consumption during World War II is influenced by the experience of inflation and scarcity. Oh, yeah. What was the inflation caused by? It was caused by the bureaucratic government borrowing money from the central banks to piss away on the funding of the war and, of course, the preservation of national art. Continuing on. The approach to curbing consumption during World War II was influenced by the experience of inflation and scarcity during the war of 1914 and 1918. The task was to ensure a fair distribution of supplies and also to foresee and obviate any difficulties. Ultimately, the public largely assented because it understood the need for action and for the restrictions. But it wasn't straightforward. Working at the height of his powers, Keynes struggled to find out ways to cut consumption and increase savings. Luxury taxes were only introduced slowly and cautiously. Writing in 1940 How to Pay for the War, Keynes coined his dilemma in the quote above in a way that resonates powerfully today, especially if we consider the possibility that oil and or gas exporters will suddenly divert their exports to countries other than the UK or keep their diminishing reserves for use at home. Despite the eclipsing severity of World War II, many people in the UK experienced deceptively good times. Wages rose and employment grew. Consequently, overall income increased substantially. This posed a question that will be relevant in the coming war against climate change. How to cut consumption of particular commodities that could make fighting the war more difficult. The government proposed higher taxes, softened by the promise of post-war credits. In effect, a form of compulsory savings was introduced, made more palatable by the prospect of greater future security. A national savings movement organized marches, processions, and displays the length of the country. Propaganda was widely used, especially where rationing was difficult or impossible, such as with certain public utilities. There is also a huge focus on enjoying low-consumption good times. There were campaigns to holiday at home and endless festivities such as dances, concerts, boxing displays, swimming galas, and open-air theater, all organized by local authorities with the express purpose of saving fuel by discouraging unnecessary travel. Over the course of the war, spending on relatively weightless entertainment went up as classic consumption went down. Initially, the rationing of coal was held back in favor of a high-profile campaign promoting fuel economy. To lead by example, very public energy restrictions were introduced in government and local authority buildings, shops, and railway stations. The result was successful, and the drop in economic coal deliveries by 1943 was greater than the cuts previously planned in an overcomplex rationing scheme. Petrol rationing, by contrast, was introduced early on and tightened to the point where rations were only made available for business and other essential purposes. The private car almost disappeared from the roads. And yeah, it's a shame because at the time before that, there were still non-oil-based vehicles on the road. Continuing, at least in the U.S. It's vital to remember that adapting was difficult even then. In the 1930s, people led sophisticated lives. A range of foreign food and other luxuries were taken for granted as much then as they are now, even if the selection was smaller. There was considerable disquiet when imported food disappeared almost entirely from the shelves. Behind all the schemes to manage demand, the objective was to secure the fairest possible distribution of whatever supplies are available and to ensure that as far as possible, the things that everybody needs shall be within the reach of all. And rationing wasn't one size fits all. There were special allowances for mothers and children, for agricultural workers and miners who lacked work canteens, for vegetarians who didn't take up a meat ration, for people with illnesses and others whose diet was conditioned by their religion. Even outside of the workplace, communal feeding was a big issue. British restaurants became a national institution. By the end of the war, there were over 2,000 nationwide, run by a combination of voluntary organizations and local authorities, serving 600,000 meals per day. Cuba, the success of the anti-model. One country that is generally maligned in Western media has already lived through the economic and environmental shocks that climate change and peak oil hold in store for the rest of the world. Does it have any lessons for us? Cuba's sudden loss of access to oil imports and its economic isolation were so extreme in 1990 that its reaction to the shock so contrary to the orthodox approaches and so successful that it was dubbed the anti-model in Washington, D.C. While we may hope that many nations never have to face the same experience and rapid cold turkey, Cuba's relative economic isolation provides the closest thing we have to a laboratory example of adaptation to peak oil. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cuba lost its cheap supply of oil. The country had become heavily dependent on those for its transport, farming, and wider economy, so the effect was disastrous. At the same time, it continued to endure one of the longest and most comprehensive economic embargoes imposed on any country. In one corner of the Caribbean, the USA refused to let the Cold War thaw. Cuba's location in the flight path of the annual hurricane season means that the island also had to contend regularly with extreme weather events. By all accounts, Cuba should be a complete basket case, battered equally by the weather and its neighboring superpower. In the face of all of these challenges, why isn't Cuba on par with some of the worst failed states in the world? Why does it not have shattered health and education systems? Why do its people not starve or suffer endemic malnutrition? The answer can be found in a rigid and centrally controlled economy, government planning, preparation, and the fact that challenges were tackled courageously and imaginatively. And a lot of people just fucking bailed and swam to America. Before the Soviet collapse, Cuba imported most of its needs. It exported sugar and tobacco to the Soviet Union at agreed premium prices and received oil in return, some of which was re-exported. This setup created distorting incentives for large swaths of land to be given over to export crops grown in industrial monocultures heavily dependent on oil-based inputs. Just before the collapse in 1989, 3 times more land was dedicated to sugar than growing food. Then, oil imports dropped by over half, crippling the economy and slashing foreign exchange earnings from the re-export trade. The use of chemical pesticides and fertilizers dropped by 80%, sounding a death knell to industrialized farming. The knock-on effect on people's daily lives was dramatic. The availability of basic food staples such as wheat and other grains fell by half. The average Cuban's calorie intake fell by 1/3 in around 5 years, leading to an average weight loss of 20 pounds per person. But, in contrast to the situation that many countries find themselves in today, Cuba was in a position to respond. Serious and long-term investment in science, engineering, health, and education meant the country had developed human resources, a strong social fabric, and the capacity to act. Before the oil shock, Cuba was already investing in forms of ecological farming far less dependent on fossil fuels. When the shock came, a system of regional research institutes, training centers, and extension services was quickly put into place to support farmers. But the foundations were laid much earlier. Successive reforms dating back to the early days of the revolution in 1959 reduced inequality and redistributed the ownership of land. Yeah, they killed a lot of motherfuckers and stole their shit. Though these were frequently and conveniently overlooked, Cuba achieved in little more than 20 years levels of literacy, health, and nutrition that were the envy of the developing world. It achieved this in spite of the U.S. economic boycott. An educated and healthy population were the foundations on which Cuba's miraculous survival were built. No, the reason why Cuba is still here is because the Cubans are self-reliant. They place self-reliance very, very high. And not only are they're very self-reliant, but they're also pretty inventive, and they don't have a lot of the same restrictions that we do here in the U.S. If we did have a lot of the freedoms that they have as far as, developing solutions to their everyday issues and deploying them, a lot of the wealth disparity that we experience here in the U.S. would simply go away. Anyway, continuing on. Drawing on these strengths, the threat of serious food shortages was overcome within 5 years. At the heart of the transition after 1990 was a rapid shift to the use of biofertilizers and bioinsecticides, crop rotation and intercropping, and the use of animal labor and manure. In other words, a largely organic system. The success of small farms and of urban farms and gardens was also an important factor. Immediate crisis was averted by food programs and targeted the most vulnerable people, the old, the young, pregnant women, and young mothers, and a rationing program that guaranteed a minimum amount of food to everyone. It was the large-scale state farms that found the change hardest. Small-scale farms responded quickly, raising their productivity above previous levels. Following the success of the peasant-run small farms, state farms were turned in 1993 into so-called basic units of cooperative production, owned and run by their workers or as cooperatives. Oh, amazing. They gave people fucking land and they were able to grow food on it. Gosh, I wonder if that would happen if they did the same thing in the U.S., where they just gave some people some fucking land and said, farm this shit. I would hope so, honestly. Anyway, continuing on. the large scale State Farms, blah blah blah. State Farms 93, owned and run by their workers or as cooperatives. Land was later made available to anyone who wanted to start an urban garden farm. Yes, that would be an excellent move right there. If you were to go to the city council and they say, hey, do we have any land that is currently fallow, that isn't really doing anything, that is, stayed on the market for like 30 years or something like that? If so, can we declare eminent domain over it and set up an urban garden farm? That's the kind of program that they're talking about here. Anyway, continuing. Shortages and rising food prices made urban farming into a very profitable activity. It also proved highly productive. Once the state backed the urban farming movement, it grew rapidly. Lots of backyards in Cuban cities became home to food crops and farm animals, grown and reared almost exclusively along organic lines. That's very, very, very smart. Yes, good. Half the food consumption in the capital, Havana, is grown in the city's own gardens. Urban gardens provide 60% of the vegetables eaten in Cuba. That's awesome. Good stuff. The country's experience suggests huge, barely tapped global potential for urban farming. In Havana alone, there are more than 26,000 food gardens. In a comparison that might be unwelcome to the current U.S. administration, Cuba's recent experience both echoes and surpasses what America achieved in its push for Victory Garden during World War II. Back then, led by Eleanor Roosevelt, between 30 and 40% of vegetables for domestic consumption were produced by the Victory Garden movement. They also weren't free to grow hemp. Continuing. Cuba's eventual transition to a more self-sufficient food system was far from smooth, but it demonstrated that it is possible to feed a population under extreme economic stress with very, very little or even no fossil fuel inputs. And as with wartime Britain, there were unexpectedly positive outcomes. Dramatic reductions in consumption, coupled with other dietary and lifestyle changes, people walked more, altered the health of the nation. As calorie intake fell by more than 1/3, the proportion of the physically active adults more than doubled, the obesity halved. Between 1997 and 2002, deaths attributed to diabetes fell by half, coronary heart disease by 35%, strokes by 20%, and all causes of death by just under 1/5. These findings were published in 2007 in the American Journal of Epidemiology and carry a profound message about the potential benefits of reduced consumption. Actually, you know what? The problems that we're having here in the U.S., you can kind of attribute them to things like homeowners clubs and the fact that, or homeowners associations rather, and the fact that we've been shifting more to rentals. Anyway, continuing on. Let's see where it is. There we go. But it isn't only oil shocks and food crises that the country has learned to live with. Compared to the tragic debacle in New Orleans following the impact of Hurricane Katrina, Cuba's ability to handle climate-related disasters appears exemplary. It is something from which many, including the USA, could learn from. People compared to the impact of Katrina in New Orleans, which killed over 1,000 people and left lasting devastation behind, the 216 km/h winds of Hurricane Michelle that hit Cuba in 2001 claimed only 5 lives, in spite of 20,000 homes being damaged. Proper pre-disaster planning with a collective approach managed by government but owned at the local level saved lives and enabled communities to bounce back more quickly afterwards. Yeah, because they weren't depending on somebody else to solve the fucking problem for them. As disasters expert Dr. Ben Weisner commented on the evacuation of 700,000 of Cuba's 11 million population, this is quite a feat given Cuba's dilapidated fleet of vehicles, fuel shortage, and poor road system. But in spite of its successes and partly unintentional positive consequences, the Cuban approach thoroughly contradicts the model of development normally sponsored by the international financial institutions. It is highly managed, focused on meeting domestic needs rather than export-oriented, largely organic, and built on the success of small farms. It is so different that it has been called the anti-model by the World Bank, but with some startled respect. At least one analyst suggests that the Cuban experiment may hold many of the keys to the future survival of civilization. Even allowing for radical differences in history and geography, any politician peering into the future of energy shock, climate change, and rocky economic prospects would be a fool to not to learn from how Cuba got it right. Its experience also supports a growing and much broader literature that describes the breakdown of the relationship between consumption and well-being when consumption exceeds the point of sufficient human needs being met. And we're going to pause it there. But yeah, we will get back into this bad boy. I think that one of the problems is that they're relying on institutions such as the IMF to provide them with statistical data for the basis of their observations, and that's why they can address the success of Cuba as the anti-model. No, it's not an anti-model. It's what happens when the people that are spending the money are most directly affected by the way that the money is spent. See, when that happens, you get this thing, it's called accountability. It's because you're saying directly to somebody, you spent my money on what? See, when you have that kind of relationship between the person that's handing the money and the person that's actually spending the money on fixing shit, you get a lot different response than if it's the IMF and they've just handed you a grant or a loan or something to that effect and said, hey, spend this way. What ends up happening? The fucking money goes to the people that had the most ready access to it, and it gets diverted the way that they want it to be diverted, most of which goes in their own pockets. It's one of the reasons why a lot of the assistance programs that have been going on for Africa have been relatively have a rather checkered success rate, because the funds aren't necessarily being generated by the people that are there, and so that you don't have the direct accountability to where exactly the funds are being spent. Anyway, let's go ahead and throw down into some music, and we may or may not get back into this thing. I was really hoping that they would get into, like their means of funding all this business. Anyway, like I said, let's get back into some music here. Pardon me. And as far as what to throw down with, here we go. Schism by Tool, here on Coin Metal. And that was Ministry with Let's Go. And it is with that I'd like to close out this episode. Thank you very much for listening. I certainly do appreciate the support. As for my own evaluations of the Green New Deal, or at least the segments that we actually read, it's the kind of thing that I would expect to be like maybe a doctoral thesis of somebody who's never actually worked in the real world, or perhaps just people that have been involved in projects funded by other people, altruistic funding, by the way. And the reason I say that is because it seems couched in reasoning where the payment for things would be compulsory, and thus the direction for the expenditure would be compulsory as well, and entirely out of the grasp or impact of the average person that's paying the tab. And how that would be any different than what we currently have, and what we're currently trying to break free of with cryptocurrencies, is your guess as good as mine. I really think that the top-down model is coming to its much needed destruction, and what will result, though, I believe, will be a much fairer and more equitable means of distribution, meaning that what you're allotted would be more based on the merit of you yourself, the product of your work, the quality of your work, the relevance of the dedication of your time and effort to the market at large, and so on. But I don't think it will be directed by the IMF or any other BIS or any other organization trying to manage things down to a single transaction in hopes of simulating the organic flow of money, where money is going where the need is perceived for it to be going, as opposed to where the entity or organization that's been tasked to addressing that issue has chosen how to spend it. Because invariably we find that bureaucracies will put their own priorities, their own political views, and their own political biases to effect long before they actually dedicate the funds to what they were intended to be dedicated to. Sorry, it's human nature. It's old as time. The funds get in somebody else's hands. Of course, their temptation is to spend it on themselves. It's human nature. So rather than trying to fight it, we should be trying to enhance it, give it an opportunity to express itself. Because when it does, it will do it in a much truer way than any bureaucrat can dream up for it. And it is with that I am going to go ahead and close this out. Thank you again for listening. I certainly do appreciate that. We will be back again on Monday at 8 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And so until then, I want y'all to trade safe. Do your homework. And watch out for your own bunghole, because not even the IMF can do it for you. And as far as our last dance is concerned, I'm going to have to do this one quick and dirty. So here it is. Death Clock. Castratacron. Last dance. See you all and have an excellent weekend. Good night.